Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. If you can, you should actually watch this episode on our YouTube channel at Bird Podcast or our Instagram channel at bird_podcast, because this is about a filmmaker, Shaunak Sen, and a film that he has made called All That Breathes, that won awards both at Sundance, where it premiered, and at Cannes, where it got the Golden Eye Award. So if you can, you should watch the film, watch this episode. So we're going to start with the trailer of the film before going into the interview. And the trailer is actually just 1.5 minutes, but it's stunning.
हटाइए इसका टेम्परेचर देख बता कितना है।
ये 1 2 3 4 लिखा हुआ है।
होगा 20 के अंदर।
अरे सारी डिजिटल वाली है इसका, इसको तो नंबर वाले
गदम तो हो गया है वैसे ये।
जिस तरह से तू नहला रहा है इसे, इसको नहाते हुए देख के अम्मी की याद आ गई। अम्मी नहलाया करती थी ऐसे हमें।
हमारा फॉरेन फंडिंग एप्लीकेशन रिजेक्ट हो गया।
फॉरेन फंडिंग एप्लीकेशन
FCR है रिजेक्ट।
क्यों करा है भाई?
पता नहीं कोई रीज़न तो दिया नहीं उन्होंने।
तो भाई कब तक काम चलाएंगे?
जैसे चलाते आ रहे थे इतने सालों से, तुम और चला लो।
तो दोबारा अप्लाई कर दो।
6 महीने के बाद अप्लाई कर सकते हैं और 6 महीने और लगाएंगे वो प्रूफ या रिजेक्ट करने में, यानी कि 1 साल के लिए आ गए। 1 साल के लिए आ गए तो
भाई फिर डोमेस्टिक पे लगाओ टाइम ज़्यादा।
Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. We have a different sort of guest for this episode. He's a filmmaker named Shaunak Sen, and his film, All That Breathes, premiered at Sundance and won the Grand Jury Award there, and then later won the L'Oeil d'Or or the Golden Eye Award at Cannes for the best documentary this year. It will release globally via HBO later this year, but I had the privilege of watching the movie. And this is the reason why I invited him for the Bird Podcast. The film is about 2 brothers in Delhi who have made it their lives' mission to save injured kites. And the film says it so poetically and brilliantly. There are very moving scenes. Now, for all of us who are involved in nature, we know wildlife rescue. We know our friends who are in that. In Bangalore, for instance, there is wild bear rescue. They do the rescue of sloth bears. And when you go meet these people who are rescuers, you know that this is some sort of a private obsession that drives them. And the film draws this out in a very light way. It's with a very light touch, because there is a scene where these brothers swim across a river to rescue one injured kite. And the entire film focuses on black kites, which are common in every city in India. And it also has some level of politicalness in it. It talks about the birds being quote unquote non-vegetarian birds, which is why traditional hospitals will not treat them. And then these brothers who learned their trade by bodybuilding decide to do it. They go for it. And against all odds, they get no funding.
बच्चा है, बच्चा आने लगे।
हाँ तो बच्चों का तो सीजन है। अभी तो आने शुरू होंगे। अभी क्या डेट हुई है? आज 5। अभी तो छोटे बच्चे भी कितना आ गए हमारे पास? 5-6 तो आएगा अब तो नेस्ट में। इसे तो वैसे कुछ नहीं सी लग रही है।
ठीक है
वीडियो में थोड़ा
वो तो हो जाएगा दीपावली
छोड़िए
इसमें है ना
एक मिनट छोड़ खड़ा हो रहा है ठीक से
काम में तो पढ़ रखेंगे
How the film began essentially was it's actually started with I think three impulses. Firstly, for anybody who was living in Delhi, you know, the air and the sky is a very singular and fairly distinct experience. The air itself becomes kind of heavy, tactile, visceral, oppressive, often gray thing, and this texture or mood or tone of this pervasive grayness was the kind of thing very vaguely that I was interested in. And I really mean it when I say I was just interested in the texture of something gray, like a broader sensorium of, because it feels like in the recent years, our lives, especially between September to February, are plunged in this kind of a unrelenting battle with this grayness, right? And you feel like you're constantly breathing in noxious fumes and so on. So I want to do something around the air. And secondly, I was also very interested in human-animal relationships. This actually began, I was visiting the UK, Cambridge University for this kind of a brief visiting fellowship thing in the geography department. And there in conversations with this friend of mine called Dr. Man Barua, who teaches there, who's himself a very avid birder, we started talking about human-animal relationships, and I just got very interested philosophically in that kind of inquiry. And it's actually through those conversations, my brain sort of started getting geared towards thinking about what's known as a more than human space of inquiry academically. And that's how I sort of started getting interested in the broader domain of this. So I came back to India and I started reading. And in a way, the film's genesis came from some of the best pieces of literature around birds. Of course, I mean, as you well know, I think more than any other animal, the bird is a kind of figure of that's inspired complete, like genuine and utter greatness in literary works, right? Poetry, music, books. And I started sort of like dipping a bit into some of this. What was genuinely inspiring and like really rivetingly captured me was, for instance, The Peregrine by J.A. Baker, which is this landmark book, and I just never read prose like this. Just this searing day-to-day journal of a person who's following the peregrine falcon. And it was just so, and what really captured me about it was this kind of a hypnotic, ravenous, otherworldly love and obsession that this one individual had with the peregrine falcon. And I was just completely in grips by the delirious fever dream of that book's relationship with the bird. Similarly, when you read another book like H's for Hawk, you feel like, the bird becomes a metaphor for so many things around trauma and mourning and grief and redemption and all of that, So, I mean, and so much of human emotions also get parceled in bird-related, in ornithographic metaphors, right? Like when one says hope is a thing with feathers or grief is a thing with feathers, conversely. So much of like these kinds of deeper or profound experiences of life get sort of articulated in a bird-like form. So, I mean, I was very interested in that kind of a hypnotic relationship with birds. And here in Delhi, I started looking, the figure of the falling bird from the sky was something that just sort of, that I got obsessed by. And we started researching people, like what happens when a bird falls down. And of course, like as happens, one chances upon the work of Saud and Nadeem, who've been saving injured black kites that have fallen off the skies for over 15 years and have saved over 20,000 black kites from a tiny, damp, derelict basement in the northeast borders of Delhi. And just it's, the scene is almost clichédly apocalyptic, like birds that are like falling in scary numbers every day. we're talking about like 25 to 30 birds at this point coming every day to their thing. And they otherwise done, as you said, kind of, so that basement is divided into this space of industrial decay and metal cutting machines on one side. And on the other side, you have these magisterial birds that are being treated. And the sheer bipolarity or duality of that kind of industrial decay coterminously existing with this kind of, these vulnerable, majestic birds, and the sheer, almost surreal environment of that house became a kind of symptom of a broader ecological malaise, but at the same time, a kind of like rare resilience of, of the brothers. And I mean, something about this man-bird complex felt very poetic and lyrical to me. So that's how the film began.
Did you spend a lot of time around these kites? Because to be in their company is kind of something I can't imagine what it's like.
Yeah, and also because these are big raptors, right? These are not tiny. And their eyes are this kind of steely, like this metallic, glowing kind of almost like an alien. There's something reptilian about them, and there's something wondrous and otherworldly and all of that. So, see, the thing is
you have that line there that's quite beautiful in your film, where one of the brothers says it's like a reptile with furious eyes, which is exactly.
Yeah. And this is him reminiscing about the first time they first encountered.
Yes.
जब हम पहली चील घर लाए, मैं देर रात जागकर उसे घूरता था। खूंखार रेप्टाइल लगती थी किसी और प्लेनेट से। चीलों को गोश्त खिलाने से सबब मिलता है। वो आपकी दिक्कतें खा जाती हैं और उनकी भूख आबाद है। हमारे बड़े हमें चील फरिश्ती के लिए ले जाया करते थे। हम जमीन पर लेटे आसमान में उनके डिजाइन देखा करते थे। सर घूमता था, लगता था आसमान में गिर जाएंगे।
The birds as children. So the thing is that it's I didn't come in, like I wasn't a birder to begin with. I had a mild curiosity with form and shapes, and anybody who's interested in the visual field would be interested in movement and visual cadences and rhythms and all of that, right? Like I would notice that birds that move faster, there seems to be some kind of harmony between outer shape, phenotype, and movement, obviously. But for somebody who wasn't initially interested in other aspects of it, I could tell that something that looked like a crossbow in the sky seemed to fly with her. Whereas something which was different seemed to shuttle about. And like there was a relationship between movement and form. That's like when I'm talking about a very early thing before I was actually interested and even dipped my toes into birding. Then, thanks to Man and a bunch of people there, and then all the reading, I got absolutely obsessed with the black kite. And through that, of course, interested and just like spend months then in the library consuming whatever I could about birding, about like all of it, like as much of Audubon as much of like all of that I could read and get my hands on, poetry, films, art, everything that I could consume about birds and in specific raptors and specifically like eagles, falcons, that kind of kites, and of course, like that kind of genre. That's how I got this. And then once I went to go to the house, there are like 250 odd black kites and other raptors there constantly. And not just kites, there are lots of owls, sometimes Egyptian vultures, all kinds of
storks. I saw storks as well.
Crested serpent eagles, Sometimes they get like all kinds of, sometimes they get peregrines, not often, but sometimes. So I was just like, like it's a bit of a, and remember that these birds have in close proximity quite some personality, right? So it's inherently cinematic. And, there's emotionally and conceptually, there's a real difference between the bird in the sky and the bird in front of you, because it's difficult to sort of stitch together as a mental map those two entities as one composite thing, because their behavior also somewhat changes and how you relate to them changes. And it makes you think differently about space, about rootedness, about mobility, your relationship to gravity. And, there's a kind of, we are stapled to the ground, and our thought itself is about two-dimensionality and movements through a connection to space. Like we're constantly flattened through the ground, right? So I feel like the bird always captures our imagination because it challenges all the foundational coordinates of our existence more than other animals. So, yeah.
So how was it to actually be around these birds? Was it scary, or was it awe-inspiring, or I don't know?
Well, it was most definitely awe-inspiring because these birds have a lot of charisma and aura, and they suddenly spotlight you with their attention, and you feel it was never scary. I mean, you get a bit nervous initially, and especially walking into the cage which has 200 odd black kites is a bit, because you're constantly like flinching, and and they're often, you recognize over time that some of them will be flying lower and close to you because they want to intimidate you. Some of them are very servile and submissive, and you start, and the crew, and like especially the directorial core group, which is 4 people largely from Delhi, none of who had any experience in wildlife talks or nature talks. We did not want to make it like a conventional nature talk at all. We paid a lot of attention to a kind of ethology of the birds, in the sense of like paying a lot of attention to behavior and recognizing individual behaviors and what were the things that we had to do. We realized that we had to move slower, not wear very bright clothes. Then, for instance, we realized that it was much easier to shoot with a crane or some kind of a protruded thing than ourselves holding the camera or on a tripod, because after a while we realized that the crane reminds them maybe of a branch or something, like a single pole sort of a thing. And then it's much easier to go close to, like when we're shooting the individual portraits of the kites. And the idea was to try and form different painterly shapes and rhythms, right? So all of that became much easier the minute we had prosthetic arms, like we had cranes and so on. So these are times, and like, over time, there's a kind of like the hive mind of the film crew begins to recognize, okay, that one's a bit catty always, this one's easy and this one's friendly, and maybe this one was imprinted, so therefore this one is friendlier and is like comes up to us and so on. So you sort of pick up the world scripts in the tiny universe of the cage itself, and you pick up the kind of like codes and modes of kinship in that. So you pick it up, you develop your own sort of vocabularies as you go along.
What a treat, because the closest I can think of is zookeepers, who have this ability to say, okay, this animal, the personalities of the different charges or their animals. But you got that as a filmmaker with the black kites.
I mean, just a quick note in terms of like the relationship of it being a zoo sort of a thing. What really affected me the first time I went to the house was that the enclosures, the cages, are actually not cages, because a lot of them are open from the top. So the birds are free to fly away if they can. The agenda of the brothers is not to imprison or entrap or keep forcibly any of the birds. If they can fly, they will fly. So it's that kind of a thing. So, but most of the birds choose not to because they can't fly, and they recognize it to be a sort of a. And then you pick up a ton of bird behavior that you otherwise would never, like for instance, bathing, kites bathing. We realized over time, and then the brothers would, of course, the brothers themselves are kind of philosophers of the urban, and they have spent so much time. So they not only know every single muscle and every single like the tricep and the bicep of the wing that gets cut and or so on, but also they've just like they know so much of bird behavior. So when I first met them, I remember Saud, one of the brothers, and I asked them how the injury happens. Injuries mainly happen. And they said, for instance, this is the string of the paper kite, the patang, and this is the bird and he just basically with this sort of a thing showed me different kinds of injuries that happen, how it happens, how the bird then falls dependent on the cut, how one look at this cut and they can tell them what angle it encountered the manja with, etc. And all of this is fascinating because it's a very specialized expert knowledge, right? And it's accumulated over years and years. And I mean, I've seen multiple ecologists, birders, etc., meet them and just be astounded by the depth of knowledge and also very emotional and overwhelmed by the fact that they do this often without much support.
Yeah.
So there's really something exceptional there.
Yeah, we have an exceptional naturalist in Bangalore called Shyamal, and one time he told me that it is the unwritten knowledge of India that is being lost, and there are people who still practice it. For example, there was a birder who worked for the British, and he would say, any bird you tell me, I'll capture it. And he knows what type of resin and gum to put, what type of the resin and gum the bird will be attracted to. It'll come and sit on it. It won't get harmed. He'll go pick it up. He knows how to track. And so, as you say, these brothers have that just through doing it.
Mm-hmm.
If you could wave a magic wand, or if the brothers could wave a magic wand, is manja would you ban, would that be a good place to start, is to remove?
Yeah, 100%. I think the brothers keep saying that the manja, especially there's this kind of stuff, this particular manja that's very sharp, that's imported from China, that I think now is either banned or about to be, I'm not sure. But that's really bad. And look, that kind of inhabitation of the sky is something that we do with the kite, where we're inhabiting the world of currents and eddies of air. What you're essentially doing is, of course, you're going to come into collision with other things there. And I think what's important is to, all kinds of inhabitation or all politics of real estate usually have costs and usually have ethical compunctions that we need to consider. And I think that's what they sort of nudge us to do. But also, look, it's not just a question of what is bad and because what's inspiring about them is that it's not just a gloom and doom, all despair. Like, I have very little patience with the kind of environmental discourse today, which is it's either ripe with a kind of maudlin sentimentality, or it's the other end of the spectrum. It's binary, is a kind of an extremely bleak, screechy, apocalyptic thing. And of course, we all know that the apocalypse is around the corner, sure. But I mean, that kind of a gloom and doom, bleaky vocabulary, especially in works of art. I'm talking only about like films and works of art, especially for filmmakers. So again, just to clarify, environmental discourse of that kind in film is actually becomes very pedantic or lecturing and off-putting, So a lot of the time you're losing the point of why you're making the film, because you're just like putting off the audiences. So, I mean, films have to be Trojan horses, and the idea is to weave in a kind of magic where you also fall in love. I mean, I could keep saying to the crew that I hope that when people leave the theaters, they immediately look up, at the skies. The idea is to enchant the skies, and very often birds are like I think it's from the Peregrine movie, that they're tremors at the fringes of our vision, right? And it's the act of making them center is a kind of visual, philosophical and ontological act, which I think is really interesting and important and generally a good conceptual move. So that was one of the points of the film.
So you captured a number of species, like there is a blackwinged stilt on a soapy water, then there are ants, then there's a lizard. There's a lovely shot of a lizard where you focus on one and then you realize there's another one in the back. Were these happy accidents, or did you?
It began with happy accidents and contingencies and a lot of, let's shoot that. It started with that. But over time, it took on a kind of blunt force where we knew that it had to become a kind of very foundational, structural, and aesthetic principle of the film. So, I mean, most of the people, I suppose, watching this would not have seen the film. So, just to explain to them that the film's architecture is twofold. One is the emotional kernel or the kind of anchor of the film, which is the brothers, and that is. But they don't constitute the sum all or be all of the film at all. There's another thread in the film which is about animals, which is that you see these long, languorous 2 to 3 minute long uncut shots of animals in the city. And usually the idea behind this whole strand was to show coexistence or simultaneity of life or neighborliness of life in the city. And urban ecology, the urban as a kind of site where animal behavior changes, animals constantly improvise, adjust, and evolve actually. So it's not just behavioral changes, but now a lot of the new science is pointing towards evolutionary changes, which are happening exponentially quicker now because of cities. So the urban is a very important kind of category in understanding non-human life, right? So one of the film's interests was in that as well, in trying to understand or disaggregate the city or the urban as a space of understanding how various non-human lives are jostling cheek by jowl constantly there. So which is why we have these shots, which the idea is to show a kind of life writ large on the canvas of the city, right? And you have therefore these really slow tilt downs, these really slow languid pans, etc., where you see the city and an animal. So you see rats, pigs, snails, turtles, and like you said, there's the film begins with a long 3.5 minute shot of just rats. You see a turtle clambering through trash and looking up then at traffic passing by as if it's contemplating the traffic walking past. And
on a gunny sack that says Twitter on it.
Yeah. So, for instance, a centipede comes out of a puddle of water. There's larvae inside the water. Like a whole sort of the idea is to open up this kind of like constant non-human life. And in a way, the title, All That Breathes, is like gets to the heart of it, right? It's something that the brothers say. The film is about entanglements, and it's about neighborliness, and it's about a kind of kinship that's like, life itself is a kind of kinship when you're part of a club that draws where everybody is breathing. And we're all, as they say, a community of air. And it's this kind of, the brothers are deeply invested in this kind of a cosmological thought, which I find very interesting, wherein it's not just about a kind of Western care for animals, which is coming from a kind of science-based or, that kind of thing, but it's humanist largely. The brothers are not just a humanist imperative, right? They are informed by it, but they're also as much interested in about life itself being, there's a different kind of vitality, and it's not a kind of vitality which is like a woo-woo kind of a highfalutin kind of a thing. There's actual kind of palpable concreteness to thinking about life as a field of things where, different kinds of interrelations, entanglements, and all of that. And all of these are words that we encounter in a lot of writing, and it feels to me a bit difficult to grasp. But the brothers kind of embodied and instantiated it in a fleshy, felt way, which was rare. And the film's impetus largely was to kind of capture a glimpse of that.
Last question for you, Shaunak, is the film talks about this, but people wouldn't have seen the film. Why do you think the brothers do what they do? Why are they rescuers?
I mean, at the heart of it, that is the unanswered question that the film is an exploration of. When you walk into that basement, which we call planet basement, it seems like cut away from the whole world. But it's this kind of a unreal, tiny world where all of the skies over Delhi are yielding falling birds, and all those birds come into this tiny, very, very cramped basement. So when you ask the brothers, they have a ton of reactions about how now it's habit. They started off with just a sort of sympathy, and Saud said he sometimes couldn't sleep if he heard of a injured bird somewhere, and then he would just go off on his bike and try and save it. So of course it started with this kind of, but like all the difficult questions in the world, there's no graspable, easy answer. And this has to take into account the psychological, the emotional, the metaphysical, and the ecological together. And that's that's the only stab at an answer that I think a film can make, which is why the film also, like you said, it's not really a nature doc, it's not really a wildlife doc, it's not really a character study, but it takes elements of all of that, right? Because essentially, if you ask yourself the question about why people do what they do, there is a kind of a graceful impossibility to it. It's an impossible endeavor, right? And there's like a staggering elegance in what they do, given that they soldier on in a kind of a unsentimental way, which is they have a kind of a wry resilience with which they just put their head down, and even though they're the front benchers in the world of apocalyptic breakdown, birds are literally falling off and landing up in there missing every day. And of course, it's taking a great toll on them emotionally and psychologically. But they still sort of like, the work has to be done. You have to put your head down and still go on. And they're still cracking wry jokes every now and then. And they're not, they don't position themselves as martyrs, or not do they have a chip on their shoulder. They somehow go about things. And it's the quotidian rhythms of their everyday life that I was very interested in, and how they think of the birds in general that I was interested in. And, I think it's Einstein's line or something, I'm not sure, where they say that the solution of no worthy problem ever originates in its original plane of conception, where you have to think of, there's a different kind of prism that has to come in when you're thinking of it. And I think, artistic things sort of deflect the way you look at extracting meaning of something. So, and that's the point of the film. So hopefully it's a kind of like, it's meant to be like a lyrical piece for, among other categories, people's categories, is also for bird lovers and ecologists, etc. Especially for people who love birds. And I've also been enrolled into this circuit of people only recently.
So Shaunak Sen, thank you so much for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Thank you.
Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. This episode will be available on YouTube and also on Instagram. If you are an audio listener, it will be available on all audio listening platforms. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening.